Annelore. I work in my local hospital here in the RUH in Bath. I do two jobs there. I'm a occupational therapist and I work with children in the community. So when we were talking earlier about slobber and getting ill, I very much feel that feel that I get ill all the time for all the kids we work with. But since about a year, I also work as part of the volunteer team in the RUH, and I was tasked with implementing our volunteer to career pathway. And the volunteer to career pathways, we got some funding for a year to implement this new pathway in the RUH. Which has been a bit of an amazing journey. The reason I applied for the job was because I was really passionate, and I am really passionate about volunteering. And I kind of figured out that I wanted to be an OT and I wanted to work with children through volunteering. When I was a teenager, I used to support children with special needs in the swimming pool, and I loved it. And that kind of made me realize that that was something I wanted to do as a career. So I think that's why I was really motivated. The other kind of aspect to it was we get lots of requests from people who are interested in occupational therapy as a kind of career, but we could never really give them kind of an insight or a way in to get them have a really good feel of what that job looks like. So I felt that actually a pathway like this in place could be really beneficial. So those were my kind of key motivators for kind of applying for the job and implementing our volunteer to career pathway. So what I thought I'll do is kind of briefly talk about kind of volunteering at the RUH, and then we can go into volunteer to career pathway kind of nationwide, and Helpforce, who are kind of the driving force behind it all, and kind of the different roles are out there, and we can touch on some of those kind of different routes, and I can touch on the money aspect as well, in a bit more detail as well. Does that sound okay?
Sounds perfect.
Brilliant.
And I think just to point out, whilst you are RUH, so Mark, who's at Helpforce, if you imagine there's a kind of like an external non-profit helping a lot of NHS trusts, I think there's 48, is that right? Compared to volunteers. So wherever you are nationally, there's a very strong chance that there is a volunteer to career pathway in a local trust. So absolutely, we should be able to, if you're interested in this following the session, we should be able to put you in touch with the trust that would be most local to your area.
Absolutely. And I've got a map. I asked Helpforce for a map. So one of my last slides, I've got a map of where all the active programs are at the moment, so that you get a bit of an idea of which your local, and we can always send that information through through as well. Brilliant. Good.
And just on that question, there is a thing in the chat about Scotland. Do you know if that applies to Scotland, Annelore?
I think it's only in England at the moment. So the big driving factor kind of financially has been NHS England. So I don't think they cover Scotland and Wales. But it's something I'm more than happy to ask Helpforce and see if they've got any similar programs that they're aware of in Scotland as well. Yeah.
Because there are, at the moment, as I say, there are the ones that are in place, but because this program is proving to be so amazing, as in it's such a good pathway for people to get jobs in the NHS over and above the other methods that are being used, then actually there's loads more trusts that are going to come online in the next sort of 12, 18 months. So even though there isn't something yet, this is proving the case for how to do it.
So very quickly, so at the RUH, we have about 225 active volunteers, which actually for kind of an acute trust of our size, we have about 4,000 employees. 225 volunteers sounds quite a large number, but actually a lot of other trusts in our local area of that kind of size probably have about double the amount of volunteers. So volunteering, as Denise said earlier, it's such a big part of the NHS. And I think that some people kind of have these opinions and worries of why should the NHS have to rely on volunteers. But I think people really want to volunteer for the NHS. They want to give back for their local community, and there's so many benefits that you can get out of volunteering, like social aspects. You can develop certain skills, and especially with our pathway like volunteer to career, there's so many additional things that come with volunteering. So our local volunteers come from kind of 4 different charities. We've got our Friends of RUH, Dorothy House, Bath Sounds, which is our radio, and RUHX. And we have lots of different roles that our volunteers do. So some of them are, I've listed there. So we've got volunteers who maintain all our gardens in the trust. We have welcome atrium volunteers, so they know the hospital inside out, and when patients present to the hospital, they'll kind of direct them in the right ways, sometimes help them get there. We have volunteers who work with patients on the wards, and that's kind of for a lot of our volunteer to career volunteers tend to do that volunteer role because it's a really good environment to get to know all those different roles that are out there on the wards. So you've got your physios, your speech language therapists, you've got your nurses, your healthcare assistants, you've got doctors, you've got ward clerks, you've got all those different roles. So it's quite a nice way of kind of observing them and seeing what kind of the different jobs look like. We have A&E volunteers who support with kind of meal times and teas and coffees and just keeping people happy while they wait, which can be a bit of a challenge. And then we've had the next two, our ophthalmology volunteer role and our children's therapies volunteer role, are kind of new roles that we developed as part of our volunteer to career pathway. The children's therapies volunteer role is kind of the role that we developed because of what I was saying earlier about we get so many people who want to be physios or OTs or speech and language therapists, and it's kind of the perfect way for them to find out more about those roles while they're supporting clinicians. We also have a beautiful role, which is the compassionate companions with Dorothy House, and they are volunteers who sit with people when they're very end of life. So when family can't maybe be there or they need a bit of a break, we have volunteers who sit with them. And then there's lots of other roles that we haven't kind of highlighted, but those are some of the main ones that we have at the RUH. So what we find really important at the RUH is if we have volunteers that kind of express an interest, we really like to take the time to understand why you want to volunteer and what experience you want to get out of volunteering. So we don't just kind of put people in a role and without kind of thinking about it. And especially for our volunteer to career volunteers, we really take the time to really figure out what volunteer role is going to benefit you the most, but also obviously support the hospital where we have needs. So this is very quickly, it's not too relevant, but I think as a trust, and I think many trusts feel very strongly that volunteers are part of their kind of workforce and they're part of our kind of community. So we try and give our volunteers some additional benefits. And 2 weeks ago, it was National Volunteering Week. So we had kind of a big summer soiree, they called it, party, to kind of say thank you to our volunteers for all their amazing work as well. So if I move on to kind of Helpforce and the volunteer to career pathway. So I'll quickly explain what Helpforce is because I don't think I have actually done that. So Helpforce are kind of a big charity and they do a lot around volunteering in the public sector. And a couple of years ago, they kind of realized, that there's all these challenges in the NHS where we have the challenges about recruitment crisis and where the NHS is spending a lot of money on bank and agency staff because they can't recruit into the NHS. And there's some numbers there about how much money was being spent on agency nurses and doctors and on bank staff as well. So obviously, as the NHS is trying to spend their money wisely, it was very strongly felt that this is not a position we can carry on being. So that was kind of one of the elements that Helpforce looked at for the volunteer to career pathway. And then the other element that came into it was, we've got a lot of people who aren't in any jobs or are not in jobs that they kind of enjoy. So if we can kind of bring those challenges together, that might be a really good idea. So the volunteer to career program specifically. So obviously every trust adapts it to their specific needs, but the in general, it looks like this. So it identifies a pathway to for volunteers to develop their careers in health and care, and it's designed around organisations' identified workforce needs. So some of the volunteer to career pathways in certain trusts have very specific pathways. So there's some trusts that have kind of a midwifery volunteer to career pathway, where the volunteers support the midwives in the maternity unit, and they get kind of that a lot of extra support. And the hope is then that they will go into those kind of specific roles, because that's where the pressures have been within the organisation. Here at the RUH, we're looking at developing some new roles specific to VTC, and some of that is linked to kind of mental health support. So again, because we know as a trust we're spending a lot of money on bank mental health nurses, while actually some of those roles might be able to be carried out by volunteers who are well trained. So the VTC is really used by trusts to help with their kind of workforce planning pressures, as much as supporting the volunteers as well. And then so it sets out kind of how volunteers can make step-by-step progress and informed decisions about applying for employment or starting education. So what we tend to say is that kind of a positive outcome of volunteer to career pathways if someone either kind of starts a role in a health or social care setting, or if they go on to further education because they feel inspired and they want to develop those skills. So, oh, for some reason it's now stopped. There we go. So nationwide, these are some of the volunteer and workforce roles that have been filled through the VTC. So there's a lot of different roles out there. And I think a lot of them are probably kind of clinical roles. So we've got your, your wellbeing assistants, your mental health care support workers, healthcare assistants. You've got physios and OTs, but it's quite nice. There's also some other kind of behind the scene stuff, like patient access administrators and digital application analysts. Because I think that's one of the things people often forget about is actually there's lots of clinical roles in the NHS, but the behind the scenes is there's so many roles out there as well. And I think only when you are kind of part of the day-to-day, you start kind of realizing and noticing all those different roles out there. Our volunteer to career pathway at the RUH looks a bit like this. So as I said, different trusts might have slightly different pathways, but in general, they all look very similar. So we've had quite like a natural volunteers that have kind of come in, and our volunteers, when they apply, have to do kind of an interview. So often it gets identified at that point, when they're kind of deciding to volunteer as part of trying to figure out kind of career steps. We haven't kind of shouted really loudly about our volunteer to career pathway because we have such kind of a natural uptake that we and our capacity is a little bit limited, which is a kind of a good position to be in. But so we take our time, as I said earlier, to discuss with the volunteers kind of why they want to volunteer, and then offer the VTC pathway if we think it's appropriate. So there's been some occasions where we have had people who want to come and volunteer but only have availability for like a month or for a couple of weeks, and they get quite a lot of extra support, and we just don't, that the development and kind of achieving outcomes is just not something that happens within a couple of weeks. So we then kind of, sometimes still encourage people to still apply, but just do normal volunteering, or sometimes we kind of redirect them to different charities where they might be able to meet those kind of specific availability needs differently. As I said, we would then try and really link up the ward and the department where the volunteer will be working to make sure it kind of meets their career aspirations. And then they get inducted. There's some shifts where our volunteers need to do additional training. So all volunteers do mandatory NHS training, and that's the same all over the country. And actually what's quite nice is, even though that's a bit of time, for health and safety and manual handling and all those things, for a lot of trusts, the training that volunteers get on those subjects is exactly the same as you would as an employed member of staff. So actually, if you then go into an employed role, you've already done a lot of that training, so you don't have to repeat it. So that's quite a nice way. And we have had lots of feedback that people find the training really relevant and really interesting. And then some of our volunteers have additional training for their specific volunteer role. So for example, our ophthalmology volunteer did some additional training with the RNIB to learn a bit more about kind of the different eye conditions and how to support people best. So it's quite nice. So there's a lot of kind of learning that you do from the start. We then ask our volunteers to do some kind of thinking work, brain work, before they kind of start as well. So we want to get to know them a bit better. So we ask them to think about kind of what their learning style is, how do we support them best, and what kind of their SWOT analysis is, which I know is a bit old school, but actually it really helps us kind of identify where we want to support the volunteer, how we can support them, but also are there any threats to volunteering? So, you know, if we have people who are volunteering but they've got a part-time job or a full-time job, or they have children, that's a lot going on. So it kind of helps us thinking about, okay, how can we make sure that you're still going to be able to come in consistently, and how do we kind of support those pressures? So we kind of take our time to think about all those things. And then I think kind of that last bit is kind of one of the most important things, is we ask our volunteers to set outcomes. So we ask them to set kind of 3 outcomes minimum of what they specifically want to achieve through the volunteer pathway. I've got some examples of those outcomes, so I won't go into detail too much now, but I think my next slide shows some of the outcomes that our current volunteers have. So all of that is discussed with the clinical lead for the Volunteer to Career programme, and then the volunteer will meet with me regularly, so kind of a monthly supervision moment where we kind of discuss how things are going, and then they get additional support to meet some of those outcomes. So if it's they want to, you know, talk to people to certain job roles, I'll be kind of behind the scenes trying to organize all of that, and we kind of monitor to make sure that they're working towards their outcomes. Our volunteers, in addition to that, get access to courses that are run in the hospital. So anything that's kind of run for paid staff, our volunteers can access if it's relevant to their outcomes. They can access our career events. They have a bit easier access to our career ambassadors. They also access our career hub, and I think that's a really valuable one, where our career hub is kind of a resource that's available for anyone who works in our trust. It's kind of a small panel of kind of different people from different backgrounds, but you can basically say to them, this is, you know, where I want to see myself in 5 years, how do I get there? And they give lots of advice and kind of specific tips on what you can explore to achieve that. They also can support with like mock interviews and advice on like employability courses. So lots of additional things out there. And I think some of those kind of interview skills and CV writing, obviously for some of us that's kind of bread and butter, and we've done that a lot, but one of our volunteers who we've been supporting, she came abroad, and when we looked at her CV, she really struggled kind of adjusting it and writing it in a way that we would expect a CV to be written, and we realized then that's why she wasn't getting any callbacks for any interviews. So kind of having that time to work with her and support her was really valuable. So on average, our pathway is about 4 to 6 months. So that doesn't mean that if you kind of after 6 months want to carry on volunteering, you most definitely can, but it's that kind of additional support and that access to those additional courses then reduces. And I think kind of in terms of what we ask from our volunteers is we kind of ask for a commitment of the actual volunteering for kind of 1 shift every 2 weeks, and the shift goes anything between kind of 2 to 4 hours. So that kind of allows you to really get to know the role, get to know the people you're working with and the staff, and then kind of have that consistency as well. So it's not a huge amount, and we've got volunteer roles both in the evenings and during the weekends, and then lots during the work week as well. So usually we can always find something that meets kind of the availability of the volunteer as well. Then finally, our volunteers have kind of a VTC booklet that supports them throughout the pathway, where they can write, if they get nice feedback from patients or staff they're working on with, if they get kind of any courses that they go to, they can record it all. It's a bit like looking at it as a kind of CPD profile that gathers all the information they need there with them. So these are some of the examples that our volunteers who we've had on the cohort, our last cohort, have been working on. So some of our volunteers wanted to have that understanding of all the different professions on the ward. So this was a kind of a girl who just finished a university degree, and she kind of knew she wanted to work in the NHS, but didn't actually know what she wanted to do. And I think through volunteering, her feedback in her last supervision was that she's kind of really felt like really kind of encouraged that the NHS is definitely where she wants to work, and she loves like being part of a team, supporting patients. We've had people who said they want to kind of talk to speech and language therapists about their role, and we've been able to organise for like shadow days with different speech language therapists. We've had people who said, I want to become more confident talking to new people and professionals. I want to work on developing my organizational skills, to kind of have exposure and gain understanding of how clinical settings work, and to find out about the main responsibilities of being a nurse. So there's quite a lot of different kind of outcomes there, and it's anything really that you can think of that is specific to your needs that we can hopefully support with. There are some volunteer to career pathways who also offer to complete the care certificate, which I don't know if people have heard of it, but it's kind of a piece of it's like lots of competencies that you work on around kind of thinking about confidentiality and communication skills and reflection and kind of set outcomes. And if you work through it, it can help you in kind of securing healthcare support worker roles a lot easier. And it's something we're looking at, whether our volunteers could do that during their volunteer roles. So then they're a better candidate when jobs come up and they'll be more competitive. So that's another type of outcome that we're looking at. So who's the pathway for? So it's really for anyone. So any people who are kind of thinking about returning to work after a career break, people who are considering a change in career, people who might find it more difficult to access a workforce because of personal circumstances. And also we also have school leavers. Our volunteers are all supposed to be 18 plus at the moment, but different trusts do sometimes take 16 plus, and there are pathways for younger people out there as well. But yeah, basically we welcome anyone on our pathways, and that's very similar for all the pathways all over the country. So I just thought I'll share two examples of kind of who we're supporting at the moment, or who we've supported in the last year. And then I think I've got one more slide about where all the different pathways are, and then we can go on to questions. So as I said, we are currently supporting someone who, she's about 40 years old, and she came to England 5 years ago, and she has a really good biomedical degree, but as I said, she's really struggled finding work in the area. And she, to kind of help with her English, she started volunteering in the cafe about a year ago, but she was really passionate about going onto the ward as well. And I think she just felt like she didn't really know what she could do with her degree in the kind of a health sector. So through volunteering, that's made a massive difference to her. as I said, we've been able to help her apply for new jobs and like looking at apprenticeships in the hospital. And she's really motivated. She really just wants anything that's kind of a little bit linked to her degree, she would be really happy with. We were able to, when we had a National Healthcare Science Week, and we had lots of career profiles that were shared about all our different healthcare scientists. So we shared lots of those details with her so that she was able to kind of figure out what, what the different career pathways all these people have done. We're also able to organize a Q&A with one of the healthcare science workers for her, so she could ask any kind of direct questions and answers. And I think one of the things that she found most exciting was actually having a walk around the lab in the hospital as well. So she got that real feel of what it looks like. And it's I think we all know the reality of it. It's sometimes about who you know, isn't it, when you apply for jobs, and actually getting her name out there, and meeting people who then might be looking at job applications when she's applying. That's really, really valuable for her as well. So that's one of our volunteers who we're supporting. And one of our other lovely volunteers, she's on a holiday at the moment, but so she graduated university a little while ago. She's in her early 20s, and as I said, she's really keen to work in a healthcare setting, but just didn't really know what profession she wanted to do. So she started volunteering on the OPAU, which is our older people assessment unit. And that's kind of a ward where we have our patients are seen by lots of medical professionals very kind of quickly to get a really good idea of what's going on. So she's been exposed to lots of different professions, and it's giving her a really good insight of those different roles, and reaffirming that she really wants to work in a healthcare setting and be part of those healthcare teams and make a real difference. So two kind of different stories, but both kind of really, really meaningful, and really excited to be part of their journeys. I just thought, because I know this question will come up, so this is a map, but we can share the slides so you have a copy of this. But so this is the map at the moment of our of the where Helpforce has the volunteer to career program running at the moment. So I think we've got about, like Lucy said, about 44 organizations spread all over the country. So quite a lot of hospitals who have implemented, because it's such a benefit for both hospitals and volunteers. And I think hospitals feel that it's allowing them to be kind of that true anchor institution for their local community, because their roles aren't just for the people that they care for, but it's for all the people in their community, and supporting people on their journey. So yeah, so there we go. So this is the QR code specifically for the RUH. But as I said, I'm more than happy to send the slides around, so you've got that list of the countrywide volunteer to career program. So I think Mark said that their the turnover rate, sort of successful positive outcomes, is at 69%. So 69% of the volunteers who go on to a volunteer to career pathway then end up working in, I think, either work in a health or social care setting, or go on and study. And I think we had that turnover rate with our first cohort of 13 volunteers. I think 10 out of 13 did that as well. So yeah.
Which is amazing. And I think when you consider, so our own surveys, we've had more than 6,000 people tell us over the age of 50, I've just got no idea what I want to do. So if you're figuring out where it is you might want to land, fine. I mean, it's not even saying that presumably, so that's the 69% end up working in the NHS. That doesn't account for the percentage of people that might go, oh, I want to go work in a private setting, and I've done all this work in the state sector, or I've got this stuff to polish up my CV. Presumably that could potentially be another outcome as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with like our volunteer to career pathway, what's really nice is that we can, if you have different interests in different areas, we can be a lot more flexible in saying, oh, you can do. We had one of our volunteers who volunteered in A&E, but actually she was really passionate about working with children. So then she came and volunteered into the children's department. So because you're on that pathway, and because we're hoping we're going to have a positive outcome in a way of that, you know, you might join one of our teams, we can be a lot more flexible. And the people, when I ask for favors, which I go around and ask for lots of favors, everyone is so passionate and so keen to help out. I've never had anyone, when I've said, oh, well, you mind meeting with this volunteer, I've never had anyone say no. Like, everyone sees, because you can very easily say, you know, these people are giving time and effort to the hospital already, so let's give them something in return for that.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I know one of the people on this call is really interested in that kind of the well-being sphere. So when you're talking about things like mental health, I'm thinking things like food, nutrition, but also she's got a background in finance. So
Yeah.
there's potential to potentially go, oh, can I shadow and spend some time with somebody in finance? And then also
Exactly.
potentially someone who's a nutritionist. Would
Absolutely.
that be
Yeah.
possible through the path?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have volunteers who like work in patient experience teams. So they don't do kind of any clinical stuff on the ward, but they do still go around, but they help in data gathering and reviewing, and they get lots of feedback from patients, which is really valuable. So there's lots of different roles. And I think it's really, because we've done this first year and we've kind of within our organization really shouted about this is what we're doing. I think we are getting a lot more teams now really interested in having volunteers. So I think it's really going to open up really a lot of kind of really interesting, not all volunteer roles are interested, but you know, like a much wider, diverse roles.
And I know we had a question about money.
Yes.
Do you want to, what's your insight on the money side of things?
I guess money is tricky in the NHS, isn't it? So obviously, being a volunteer, there's not any money into that. I think what I would say is that the volunteer roles can lead, as I said, they cover, you know, from entry level roles all the way up to the very different roles, and better paid roles. So I think it can give you that in and having conversations with people at different levels of the organization. I guess there's difference of opinion about how well paid the NHS staff are. It's very, I think it's very open. You know, if you want to look at pay, how we're paid in the NHS, if you look up the Agenda for Change, it has all our details on what you get paid for. I think the NHS, the behind the scenes is growing a lot, and we have so many more people teams or improvement teams. So there's some really interesting roles there as well, that tend to be more band 6, band 7 roles, which are a bit better paid than some of the entry level roles. So they could be interesting ones to look at. I think different trusts do this differently. So I think that definitely some trusts have kind of a open, so with us it's kind of just open roll on, although we are probably going to change that slightly. So what we're going to try and do is kind of have 3 groups, start at 3 different times of the year, and then have about a cohort of about 10 people. So we'll probably kind of advertise that on our recruitment pages that we have opportunity to roll on. I think most trusts, because you volunteer in the NHS, it can be quite a bit of a lengthy recruitment process, because most trusts do ask for kind of 2 references. You'll need a DBS check, and if you work closely with patients independently, or if you would be working with children, that might have to be an enhanced DBS check. And then there's often kind of an interview. It tends to be quite informal, but it is part of the process. So that tends to take about, I think in our trust, takes about two weeks. And then there is that kind of additional mandatory training that you have to do. And I guess that links a bit to like that money question as well, because there's actually a lot of training that some people might be going on courses and paying money, while actually some of that training you'll be getting free as a volunteer, and you'll get some really interesting insider knowledge in some of those roles. But yeah, that tends to be kind of a application. You know, those kind of general questions: why do you want to volunteer? Where do you think you want to volunteer? Getting those references, DBS checks, and then the mandatory training, and then you tend to be good to go for then your ward specific or volunteer specific inductions, which, depending on where you would be, might be that you do 2 shifts with someone and then you're okay to go out on your own, or it might be 2 or 3 shifts if it's a bit more complex. So yeah. So with our volunteers, we've had everyone who had an interest got onto the programme. We've got 5 people on the waiting list at the moment. That's only because we were at a point of finding out whether we were getting more funding to carry on. So we've had to say to them, we just got to hold on. But I'm excited to email them later this week and say, right, we can get you get you going. But yeah, I don't know for each specific program. I don't know. I think in general they tend to get as many people on because they want to help people and support people and get people into the NHS.